All right, I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to today's webinar, Who Can Experience My Post, an accessibility guide to everyday social media. My name is Fernanda Sierra Suarez. I am a light-skinned Latina woman wearing black sleeveless turtleneck shirt. I have red hair and is currently down and shoulder length. I am wearing flower-shaped black and yellow beaded earrings, a hoop nose ring, and transparent glasses. My background is a bright, gloomy window and beige walls. I am the network coordinator at Culture Days National, and I use she, her pronouns. I am delighted to be joined today by communication specialist, artist, accessible designer, and facilitator today, Yasmin Nemat Allah, and interpreters Savannah and Dean from the Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service. Today's 1-hour webinar will include a brief introduction, a presentation and demo from guest facilitator Yasmin, and lastly, a brief question and answer period. Feel free to use the chat to let us know who you are, where you're from, and where you're tuning in from. And if you have specific questions about the presentation, make sure to submit them to the Q&A box so we don't miss them. Today, I'm speaking to you from the Culture Days National Office located on the Treaty Lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the traditional territory of many peoples and nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples. The city, now known as Toronto, remains the home and meeting place for many Indigenous peoples whose presence and cultures continue to shape and influence communities today. And today, especially, I'm very thankful for the bright sun that is bringing us warmth, weather, and spring. We are very grateful to be hosted on this land. This webinar is part of resources that we offer year-round and in preparation for the National Culture Day celebrations in the fall. Culture Days is a national celebration of arts and culture this year running September 23rd to October 16th. Over this 3-week run, organizers, volunteers, artists, creators, and community members from all over Canada showcase the important role that arts and culture play in strengthening communities. Visit our website, culturedays.ca, for more information to learn how to participate. So I am delighted to welcome Yasmin as facilitator today. So I'll pass it on to you, Yasmin. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Fernanda, for that amazing introduction. And thank you to the interpreters for the work they're going to be doing with us as we go forward. My name is Yasmin Nemat Allah. I'm going to go through the awkward 4 seconds of trying to share my screen. And I need a nod from people that we are seeing the screen. Yes.
We're seeing the screen.
Amazing. So my name is Yasmin Nemat Allah, and I'm a very smiley 5-foot Egyptian light-skinned woman wearing a headscarf traditionally known as a hijab. My hijab is an off pink pearl white with faint sparkles and a black bandana underneath it. I'm currently wearing a black shirt, and in the background there are these beautiful prints that my sister got me for my birthday, and this metal piece on a light blue wall. So a little bit about me is that I am an artist and art worker in Takaroto, Turtle Island, and a lot of my work considers dialogue surrounding the futility of translation and interpreting in terms of the work that we do as organizers, as language, visual culture, and even experiences. That also transfers to my art worker hat. I work mainly in communications in the online realm, and that means that I'm always trying to take information and translate it in access-driven ways that are rooted in activism. I'm interested in how, as art organizers and art practitioners, we hold an important responsibility towards our communities. How do we serve them? How do we care for them? How do we advocate for them? How do we create moments of revolution and mutual aid for them that benefit them and make them feel as seen as we are able to allow them to be seen? In this workshop, we're going to be chatting about how social media can be a method of revolution. And I know it sounds really big when social media sounds sometimes really silly, but I want you to definitely think about social media as a space to activate anti-racist and anti-capitalist revolutions. We'll then take it to the micro level and then chat about how activism can exist and be propelled by each of you in an online context in the capacity of an accessible social media post. I understand many of you are here today representing arts orgs and collectives, maybe even representing yourselves as artists. So my goal is to provide you some knowledge and tools that you can take away to inspire meaningful community building and inform your own advocacy initiatives in online spaces. It's really important to acknowledge that the information you're about to hear from me comes from teachings and labor done by folks with marginalized identities, BIPOC activists, disabled artists, queer organizers, visual and audio translators, and interpreters like the one we have today with us. We would not have much of these learnings without their experiences. And frankly, many of us would not even have lived through this pandemic the way we did without their writings, their advocacy, and their dreamings. So let's get going. Online platforms have the potential of becoming spaces of protest, of care, of community organizing, of educating, of art making, and inclusion. I want you to think about online platforms in the capacity of that statement. Something as simple as a Facebook or Instagram post has the ability to be a small act of anti-capitalism and anti-oppression through simple additions and considerations to your everyday posting routines. Many of you might be familiar with Audre Lorde's quote, "Master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but will never enable us to bring about genuine change." Here, Lorde is referring to how we can't use the tools we are oppressed with to create change. Social media and the internet are built on and function using the master's tools with systems like capitalism, patriarchy, racism, classism, and disableism. However, while Lorde tells us about the futility of using the master's tools to create change, we acknowledge the totality of capitalism and how sometimes we can and should use these tools, in this case, social media, as methods of revolution, of radicalism, and community building, and most of all, as tools to help us take care of one another. One of my favorite things in the world is this Vancouver Facebook group. It's a private group made by a small community that one of my friends belongs to. And they apply spoon theory onto this Facebook group. If you're not familiar, spoon theory is a concept developed by Christine Miserandino and the disability and chronically ill community. And it's using spoons as a metaphor for units of energy that a person can have every single day. So let's say taking a shower costs you 4 spoons, but hemming your pants will also cost you 4 spoons. What happens in this Facebook group is that people will post this spoon dilemma and this choice and ask someone else for 4 spoons, AKA, can you hem my pants? Can you, like not shower for me necessarily, but like help me do something else that will allow me to keep the spoons I'm working with. And as someone who grew up in a capitalist world, it's sometimes very hard to imagine a world like this existing, but it works. And we saw it happen constantly during the pandemic. Instagram tutorials of how to grow your produce for the summer, TikToks on how to protect yourself during a protest, what to say, what are your rights, everyone offering resources, teachings, and knowledge as mutual aid. We saw art organizations around the world share their archives online for people to enjoy, encourage social media spaces to become spaces of connectivity, and take their own free workshops and exhibitions online in order to create accessibility for their audiences and their viewers. Everything about the work that we do can become a fountain of knowledge and ability sharing. And when we realize that we are able to exchange skills and resources outside of capitalism and gatekeeping in order to care and support your community, we become rooted in the communities we are in service to. Posting an acknowledgement of oppression as an art organization, prioritizing the payment of artists in social media spaces, pushing for Black and Brown artists to be represented and seen, we allow ourselves to make an extremely radical and revolutionary shift towards care practices when we acknowledge the power that exists in our online spaces. And on the individual and organizational level, these things have existed forever and in endless ways. For example, online petitions that are shared in people's stories are spaces of online activism, where people can communicate with others worldwide regarding their cause and are often shared on like Facebook and YouTube and their Instagram. And these things ignited things like the 2011 Arab Spring, which is something that is really close and dear to my heart. It started in Tunisia and it's in Egypt, and it started from Facebook chats and Facebook groups. When we think about these specific considerations and how a Facebook group can be the pinpoint of a revolutionary, very much like this capacity to gather as a community in something like the Arab Spring that existed almost 10 years now, is an exciting idea to know that something small as a chat can trigger something like the Arab Spring. Mutual aid and community building online become these methods of like protest. We start creating ways for us to protest the systems that harm us. We use the internet to uplift grassroots narratives and redistribute resources. And these platforms help individuals and initiatives to mobilize a global community and create collaboration opportunities between groups of otherwise not necessarily connected people. Wikipedia is a good example of this, and the way they put out thousands of pieces of information for no cost. And even on a monetary level, something like a GoFundMe allows us to support each other in ways that we go against capitalism and racist systems. There is a buzzword in the online world called slacktivism, which is basically half-hearted activism on the internet that lacks actual engagement with the actual struggle. As we are talking about how social media has the ability to be revolutionary and be extremely important and be methods of activism and radicalism, I want us to also acknowledge slacktivism. So think about this, posting the Black Square, for example, on Blackout Tuesday, or writing a post about how horrified you are by another mass shooting, but not necessarily doing anything about those causes. This doesn't do much for the communities affected. Your online activism cannot stand on its own. That form of watered down advocacy is how online platforms assuage our need for change. You cannot share a GoFundMe and not necessarily believe in the redistribution of your own wealth if you are able to do so, or donate to it in the first place if you can. Online platforms will create the illusion that your awareness of a topic is the same as taking action towards it. That's false. Your online activism needs to exist in the context of offline activism, whether it being offering resources or money or volunteering your time, teaching your skills, whatever it may be, as long as you're not gatekeeping the skills that you do have, all of this work is offline activism. Paired with online activism, it becomes revolutionary. The performativity of online activism gives you the clout you want, but not necessarily helps the communities that you are working with. accessibility in social media. So now that we've chatted about why we should care about accessibility in our social media posts, let's actually implement it. I want us to go through a Facebook post together in the different components of it. And we're gonna go through the visuals, we're gonna go through the graphics, photographs, alt text and image descriptions, emojis and hashtags, and how all of these different components can be made a little bit more accessible than you might be working with in this very moment, starting with your visual. If you find yourself in need of a graphic for a social media platform, make sure you consider contrast and color. Text and background colors that lack contrast are hard to read and hard to consume. Use tools like WebAIMS, which we're gonna look at in 1 second, to see how your design stacks up. It's really tempting as artists, and I'm an artist myself, so I know I fall into that temptation a lot, to want to create a moody poster with a blue text on a blue background and call it a done job because it looks really pretty. And while that might be your aesthetic, there is a part of your community that not only can't enjoy said aesthetic, but can't even consume the information you've provided. So let's go through WebIM Checker and see what it looks like, just so you can have an idea of what checking for contrast colors when you're designing can look like, and how you can help folks who are colorblind, older adults, or even those who might struggle with reading faint text, make their lives a little bit more accessible when they're consuming your graphics. So I'm going to move to this tab over here. So this is WebIM. It's WebIM.org. It's a great organization that functions with accessibility in mind. This specific link is really powerful. When you are designing, I want you to think about your foreground colors and your background colors. If you're going to put a text color, let's say, in this case, our foreground text color is going to be, let's say, a dark blue. And then our background color is a red. It tells you that you have failed in terms of the accessibility of your graphic. So all of these fails are a hint to you that if you made a graphic combining these two colors, they will not be accessible for folks online or whatever you're using that graphic for. Let's try something else. Let's say I want to do like a darker color, but on a lighter background. Let's say like this, a pastel pink. You immediately get told that you've passed that sort of test. So using that combination will allow people to actually consume your graphic in an accessible way. And it tells you what ratio that you are accepted in. You can even increase the ratio. Let's say if it's completely white background, that is an almost perfect ratio of a 17.86. As you well know, a black and white never goes wrong in terms of accessibility. But if you are a little suspicious about what your color is or what colors you should be using, go directly to webim.org. I know it's something that I use multiple times a day in order to test how a color will fit with another color, and if it is an accessible combination for those who might be colorblind, who might not be able to consume the information if it's too light, who are blind, whatever it may be. As long as you are able to kind of access that information in this way, it just gives you a chance to give it a run through before you put it out in the world. Let's go back to our presentation. Another really important part of thinking about visual is in terms of fonts. It's preferred to use sans serif fonts when it comes to creating graphics that are accessible. To those who might not be familiar, the word serif just means tail. And as you can see in the image right in front of you in the blue, it shows you here that letters that are called sans serif don't have little tails, whereas letters that are serif fonts have these little tails at the end of them. what this does, fonts with tails, aka serif fonts, can become inaccessible for folks who happen to be dyslexic. The letters start connecting, they begin merging and become extremely difficult to consume. Sans serif fonts, on the other hand, have the advantage of having each letter be separated from the other letters. One of the most hated fonts of all time, Comic Sans, is a serif font, and it is a very accessible font. And like, don't get me started on this, but in another world, I believe that the hate towards Comic Sans is actually rooted in ableism. So let's not go through saying bad things about Comic Sans anymore. So Comic Sans, as we mentioned, is a very accessible font. And if you want more sans serif fonts, all you need to do is Google the words sans serif fonts or accessible fonts, and Google will provide you with a list of fonts that you could use in order for you to make whatever graphic that you're using a little bit more accessible. A really good tip that I use and I provide for other people is if you squint when you're reading and you find that the letters are blurring, you're going to find that this is probably an inaccessible text. If you're finding that you can't clearly see what the graphic is saying once you squint, that is probably because you're using a serif font of some sort that is making your graphic inaccessible. Alt text, also known as alternative text, is a wide umbrella of different levels of image descriptions. However, in the case of social media, our alt text is fairly specific. So I want us, if you have a pen, a paper, a notepad, or even just your phone, I want us to go through an exercise together. I'm gonna get my stopwatch running over here because we're gonna time this little exercise. So I want you to look at the image that I have posted over here. Look at the image for 5 seconds and then write down in a sentence what you saw in 10 seconds. That's how long your alt text should be. So I'm gonna give you 5 seconds on the clock to look at the image, and I'm gonna start now. Okay, and then you have 10 seconds, write your alt text. And that's 10 seconds. So that probably felt like no time at all. But it's a very good exercise to get you to a point of understanding that alt text needs to be short and precise. I want to share the alt text that I would have written, and this is cheating, by the way, so it's okay if your alt text does not look like this. But the alt text that I would have written for this image would have been: a person sits on a chair with the American flag wrapped around their head. The alt text that we're using, as we've mentioned, needs to be short and precise. This alt text is used only for screen readers and can't actually be consumed in any other way when it comes to social media. So it's meant to be an easy and straightforward description of your image. So then the person using the screen reader can get a general idea about the image and then move on to the caption of the post itself if they so wish. Let's see what an alt text looks like when we're trying to put it on Facebook posts, for example. I have my Facebook post open here. So this is my personal Facebook. Let's try to take this out. And I put the image here as something that we're going to use in order to post. Facebook posts, when you're working with them, has an option to edit. If you go to the edit button, edit. Let's enlarge this so I can see. There you go. So if you go to the edit button, you're going to find a text that says alternative text. If you click that, you can then put in whatever alternative text that we've just written together. So for example, a person, I forgot the text, person covering their head with an American flag. Right? And after you do that, you basically will press save. And that will allow you to basically have the alt text inside of the image itself. Now, that alt text is not something that you will be able to see. It's something that will be used almost exclusively for a screen reader when someone who is blind is using the screen reader to scroll through social media. If you're ever interested in what a screen reader sounds like or how it functions, all of our phones, so your iPhones, your Androids, will have screen readers in them if you go to the accessibility settings. And I think it's really important for if you are interested in making your posts more accessible, it's important to see what a screen reader does and how it works. So if you go inside it and scroll through your social media, you'll hear the alt text that you created inside of the image, but you won't see it anywhere necessarily. So, image descriptions. I want you to consider image descriptions as an elaboration of an alt text. If you were given 1 minute to look at this photo instead of the 5 seconds I gave you, what would you describe? So I want us to do that one more time. Let's give you 1 minute on the clock and let's see what you would describe after that if I gave you a minute. So I'm gonna start my counter. You have 1 minute. Don't take your eyes off of it. Amazing. That's a minute on the clock. So you have 1 minute. Write your image description. On the clock, you have 1 minute. And that's a minute. So that also probably felt like the shortest amount of time possible to write an image description, but a really good exercise to get yourself into the habit of writing short alt text and short image descriptions is to basically allow yourself a timer and to work within the time limits and parameters that you feel are appropriate for you in order to avoid the tendency to create extremely long and extremely elaborate alt text and image descriptions, which are definitely not accessible because they actually impose a certain amount of time on the screen reader in order for them to read your alt text out loud and to experience the post. So think about how long you go through a social media post and think about how long a disabled person who might be using a screen reader requires to take through the post. So compare those things and then make your image descriptions and your alt text accordingly. So how would I have written an image description like that? Image description, color image, artist Alexis Rivera, because that is an artist that I love, and this is their work, is in a sitting position wearing a black sweater on a black background. A piece of fabric exhibiting the American flag encloses her face and head. There is a zipper that runs down through the fabric And that's the image description. That is everything that I deem important that stood out to me as a translator of this image. Let's go back together to that Facebook post. So we had the little detail for American, we're saving, and this, so as you can see, you can't actually see your alt text. Then the very natural question is like, Yasmin, what's the difference then? Why should I do an alt text and an image description? And I will say that I'm very glad you asked. While alt texts are invisible inside of photographs, image descriptions are visible for everyone to see. For example, I can write in my caption, "Hello world," exclamation point. I really love this art piece. And then I will give an indication for whoever is reading my image, my caption, that I will be providing an image description for the image that I have tagged or posted. So an image description, and then image description, I'm going to take this out, color image, and then I will paste the image description we worked with. Why an image description is actually longer is due to the fact that when, let's say someone who uses a screen reader consumes the alt text that you provided, but they would like more information. You gave them minimal, you gave them less than a sentence because you knew that they wanted to just go through the motions of a social media post, but they're like, oh, interesting. They said something and I want more of a visual of what the actual image is. And then they can kind of turn to the caption, read whatever you wrote for the caption, and it would be like, "Hello world, I really love this art piece." And then because you've created a signal for yourself with the image description words, they will realize that you are adding more information and more context for the image to them that is a bit longer and a bit more specific to what the image contains and entails. Alt text in general, social media posts are becoming more regularly trying to create them automatically. So Instagram and Facebook will actually make automatic alt texts. They are terrible. Usually they'll just describe a black screen. There will be nothing interesting about it. They're just inaccessible, even though the machine and the AI are trying to read what the image is. That's why it requires you as the creator of the content to go back into the image and try to basically write an alt text that fits it. And then for folks who might not find something, might not be using a screen reader in the first place even, can come back to the caption and then say, oh my God, I didn't know that the artist was called Alexis Rivera, or I had no idea that this was the American flag, or I didn't know that this was the way I was supposed to approach the creation, or like approach the image and approach the artwork. So going back to our presentation, I want you to think about image descriptions as something that exists outside of the image itself, and more likely in the caption, even sometimes as like a pinned comment. An image description is useful for, as we mentioned, for a screen reader, but it also is useful for folks who might be completely overwhelmed by a visually complex image, like art, like all art, or not even be sure where to look when considering an image of an artwork. A simple example. My mother tongue is Arabic. I'm Egyptian, as I mentioned, and in Arabic, we read from right to left. What this means is that sometimes visually, I will consume information from right to left. Now, that might not matter in this specific context in this photograph, but what if it does? What if you're offering me pieces of like a comic, for example, and I read it from right to left and I'm not supposed to? I'm supposed to read it from the other way because it's written in English. An image description allows you to navigate and translate this visual experience to your audience. It also happens to be a space for some creative interpretation from you as the translator. I say this in all of my workshops, and I'm going to say it now. There is no right or wrong way to actually write image descriptions and alt text. There is just the transparent way of doing it. As long as you are in constant negotiation with your community about what they could expect from you as the translator of these alt texts, of these image descriptions, the world really is your oyster. There's a spectrum of image describing. You can start from completely accurate to wonderfully creative image descriptions. There are some incredible artists out there who I'll drop their name in the chat after the workshop, whose whole work is basically creating alt text and image descriptions in the form of poetry. What if we wrote poems for each other in terms of visual description? What if we described imagery in the form of a poem, in terms of a feeling, whatever it may be? A lot of folks who use screen readers and read image descriptions have told me personally that they find them extremely dry, they find them extremely boring. But then now when I talk about image description, I always tell the people that we are like conversing on how to create more interesting image descriptions of like, if you are at a beautiful beach with a gorgeous skyline, and you call someone really dear to you, how would you tell them what you're looking at? Would you describe it with love? Would you describe it with care? Would you describe it as an act of revolution in itself? I definitely want you to think about image description as a love letter to visuals, but also a love letter to our disabled community. How do we create them in such a way that gives us the chance to make them accessible, but also informative, but also feeling, but also interesting and fun, and not necessarily a poor translation of a visual that they may not be even interested in experiencing? So some kind of questions that you need to think about when you're ready to write an image description is the image black or white? Starting very simple. Is the image in color? Is it black and white? What is a piece of the perceived identity that I can provide in the image? For example, Alexis Rivera is a Black person. And that means that as a describer, if I didn't know Alexis Rivera's name, I would describe them as a Black person. And that description is really important because it triggers a sort of like significant piece of information for whoever is consuming it, that this person is being represented, that it's important to see that representation reflected back to me as someone who might not be consuming the visual. Are I can describe if the person is racialized, I can describe them to the reader as like someone who might be trans, if that information is available to you. And obviously you have some sort of permission from the person to have that sort of information. I know folks who will be very transparent about their bias and will say something along the lines of like, oh, this person is female presenting, acknowledging the bias and how they navigate the world. That is their way of kind of translating the information in image descriptions. I, on the other hand, I'm much more comfortable using they as a constant pronoun in the work that I do, because I am much more comfortable keeping it a lot more general if I'm not necessarily aware of the pronouns of the person. And as long as I have that negotiation with my community, and as they are aware of the kind of translation that is specific to me as Yasmin, as the translator for them in that specific context in my personal social media, in the social medias that I manage, then it's really important to be willing to mess up in that case, and be very willing to make mistakes, and be very willing to have an audience member or community member tell you that they don't enjoy how you've written that image description. And that is a privilege that you get as folks who are creating like accessible social media. You get someone to tell you, you are doing it wrong. Can you help me experience what you've made better? And the answer should always be yes. How can I do that? So definitely carry your reader through the image. Carry it from, is it the background, middle ground, or foreground? Is it better to carry them clockwise, anti-clockwise? And as long, again, as you're transparent and you're explaining to them that this is your creative or accurate interpretation of an image, at the end of the day, it is your negotiation with your audience and their needs to see what the best approach really is. Camel case is a fun word that basically means capitalizing each word in your hashtag. I want us to go through this exercise together because it's fun and it's brutal. So try reading this. and read it the way a screen reader would read it, which is as one word. Screen readers require capitalization of words in order for them to recognize them as words, especially because there are no spaces in a hashtag. So if a screen reader were to read this, it would be like hashtag I need to go to a walk soon, right? And maybe not even then, because it's such a complex word that the screen reader cannot recognize as a separate word. What Camel Case does is you, as the social media creator, would need to capitalize every single word regardless of grammar. So if you're thinking, oh, I shouldn't capitalize an A because traditionally we wouldn't, ignore that completely. In this case, A is a word and you would capitalize it as hashtag I need to go to a walk soon, right? Which is something that we probably all need to do. So why is that important? It's important because the screen reader won't recognize these different spaces and won't recognize them. But if you give it the chance to and make all of your hashtags accessible, it'll give you an opportunity to basically make these little sentences, if folks use sentences in their hashtags, as accessible as possible. Another case that happens a lot on social media is emoji usage. I'm a big fan of emojis. I know I use them in my social media, but using emojis too many times is a crime against humanity. So the problem is that an emoji, when a screen reader recognizes it, it recognizes it as its given name. So for example, a screen reader, like the emoji set that we have together, will be recognized as tongue out smiley face, tongue out squinting eyes smiley face, tongue out one eye squinting smiley face, tongue out weird eyes smiley face, and so on and so forth. And having multiple emojis on social media as terms of like a joke or whatever it may be might seem like a funny thought at the time, but what it ends up being, it becomes a very inaccessible, exhausting experience to read a caption. So if I go, for example, back to my little post here that we're creating together, I will be having, let's say, I want my hashtag to be art experience. And if you can tell, I got recommended art experience, not capitalized by Facebook. I want you to ignore that because Facebook does not know to make this accessible. And then I'll have, let's say, art post. I can even have art. And those how my hashtags would look. They would be well capitalized, and the screen reader will know automatically because of the hashtag at the beginning. They will know that it's supposed to read every single word as a separate word and not necessarily as an ongoing word that it just doesn't recognize. And if I choose to put, let's say, an emoji, I'll just go through any of the emoji. I can just use the one. Let's do this one. Let's say we just want a fun one, and that's enough. Or if you want to put one at the beginning of your post and one at the end, you can, but put emojis and use them as emphasis, not necessarily as a conversational tool, just because they get quite brutal when you get them from a screen reader. So let's go to our last but not least, our edit, practice, and translate tip. Your first alt text will sound so incredibly bulky and awkward. I know that the first time I wrote an alt text, it was basically a short novella. Your first image description will probably feel like an essay. I want you to edit, and then edit some more. Visual writing, interpreting, and alternative text is very much rooted in translation. And I am someone who has been translating for a huge portion of my life in different capacities. I am fully aware that it's a futile act of love, wanting to take an information piece and translate it into another will always be something that is impossible to do, but we should endeavor to do nonetheless. you need to think about two main things when you're basically making an accessible post. There is no right way to do it, and it will never be perfect. This is first and foremost, again, a translation of language. There will be things that will be lost in translation, but with practice, you will get better at speaking it. Definitely embrace that and take that in, and take in the fact that the negotiation between you and your audience will be rooted in your want and capacity for care to them, and their want and capacity to want to understand you in the first place. But I want you to think about social media as even something that this workshop might not be able to cover right now, which is something like TikTok, which is a complete video medium. Let's say you're making video content. Think about making subtitles. Think about your auditory content. Do you have a script that you can provide to your ASL interpreters? Do you have ASL interpreters? Consider the barriers you can't perceive, and then ask your audience or community, what do they need? Ask your friends, ask your family. My mom once pointed out that she can never read my Instagram story because I write a lot and the font is really small and you can't zoom in at all. And now I do less of that because it's something that makes an experience for her inaccessible. So it definitely makes the experience inaccessible for other people. Be willing to shift your content making into an accessible mode of creation, which will allow you to revolutionize the way you create. You'll always be considering what the communities you're in practice with want and need, because you want to create content that is accessible to them at any given moment. Asking yourself these questions and these inquiries might seem extremely daunting at first because, hey, sometimes you just want to post an Instagram photo or a Facebook photo and not have to think about it. But as art organizers and as art practitioners, we are beholden to the communities we build, the communities we support, the communities we create in. Creating access in small capacities in our everyday social media creates ripples in ways that nothing else will. Until a year ago, alt text was something not many people did, but now people are getting excited about it. They're writing it as poetry, they're writing it as love letters, they're writing it as critical and accurate, and they're writing it as its own sort of language and art, the way it should be. Imagine our images and the world and art specifically is so purely visual, but we wanted to make it more accessible. We want our disabled communities to not feel isolated from the visual world. We're not there yet, but something as simple as your social media post can work towards that, building access into your material the same way you build any habit you've ever built it. So repeat, edit, practice, and translate. And I really think you would make a very accessible post that you can work with and develop as you go along in your journey as a social media translator. And that is my presentation and my workshop. I hope that was helpful. And please hit me with all of your questions, your inquiries, your comments.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for all the essential information and sharing those applications. I think most importantly, just for doing it in such an intentional way, and one that really encourages us as folks working in arts and culture to put into practice advocating for an equitable sector and for stronger creative communities. And also, thank you so much, everyone, for contributing to the chat. It's been super lively and active throughout. And we do have a few questions to go over.
Yeah, please. I tried to leave as much time as possible in case there were multiple questions, because I saw the chat and it was bumping. So,
of course, yes. Okay, we do have the first one here. So is the point to determine what the most important point of the image is and describe that rather than in the entire image?
Yes. Think about the image. The very first things that caught your attention in an image is probably the most important things that you should be describing. Let's try to describe my background, for example. The very first thing that caught your eye in me is my face. that there's a person in my Zoom box. And then everything in the background is a bit more detail. Think about how much you consume when you're experiencing an image, and then try to kind of put that into your alt text and into your image description. That's a really good question. Thank you so much for asking it.
Next one, do you need, one second, do you need specific, do you need to specify in alt text or image descriptions if something is a photo, a painting, a graphic?
I would. I like to do that. Sometimes it's harder when it's a photo of a painting, for example, because technically it's a photograph, but also it's a painting. And in that case, I would, again, make a choice about what's important in the photo. If the important part is the fact that it's a painting, then I would be like, there's a painting, it has a green like gesture on it, and it has a person in the painting of some sort. But let's say it's a gallery setting. Let's say there are multiple paintings. So in that case, I would treat it as a photo, because the main part isn't necessarily the paintings, it's the fact that it's a gallery setting.
Got it. Another question related to what to include in the descriptions. So should the artist copyright information, should we always be included when posting alternative text?
No. So your copyright information of what the image is can exist in your caption, but it shouldn't exist in your alt text and your image description. Dedicate the space for describing what the image is to your alt text and your image description, but then definitely have the copyright information of any image that you're using in your caption before your image description. And think about it this way. A screen reader will go through the caption bit by bit. It will go through your comments, and then it will read your copyright information if that's available. But what people can do is they basically can go through like a screen reader pretty quickly as they get used to it. And then they'll just catch the word image description and they'll seek it out. And if you traditionally put it at the end of the post, they'll know that that's where they need to go in order to catch that image description that you've made for them. But a copyright does not belong in either of those spaces.
Got it, got it. Before we move into video descriptions, there's a few more about images. So do you have any advice about text-heavy images, for example, comics and graphic novels?
They're so hard. These are one of the hardest things to image describe, because there is no way around making them more accessible unless you put all the text in the image inside of the image description. What I do, and kind of what I've created as a sort of like negotiation with my community, is that if they request, I will offer an accessible PDF version of whatever image I have for them. So let's say, like, I'm a poem writer, for example, and sometimes I'll write extremely long pieces and I'll post them on Instagram, a notoriously inaccessible like website. And instead of putting this chunk of text that is so long and it's just will not aid their experience, I will put at the very end of my post, image description, a poem, this color, the text is this color. Please, if you would like to read an accessible version of this, I have a PDF version, which I can send to you.
Lovely, thank you so much. Is the process for video descriptions the same of image descriptions, or which other factors should we take into consideration?
Video is a whole thing on its own. We would need at least a couple of workshops in order to actually cover video, but there are multiple components to video. There are subtitles, and there is something like an audio description of a video. I definitely would encourage you to visit audio video describers, their websites, and support them in whatever way that you can. There is an art to that in its own, where folks will go through an image and basically image describe as an auditory experience and implement it into the video. Your TVs will probably have that if you ever go exploring. In order for you to, let's say, some cable channels will probably have the option. You can see it. It's just like, oh, for deaf folks or for blind folks, there is an accessible version of this TV show. You can access your setting and experience what that kind of looks like. But definitely it is a bit of a process of making your video accessible in terms of your subtitles, your captions, and then the video description in itself, which usually will be very short when you add them to a social media post, but hopefully with the intention to have a longer version of the description in some other capacity.
Yes, yeah. We have time for a couple more questions, and there's a few of them regarding stories. I know you mentioned it briefly, for example, Instagram stories, Facebook stories. What approach should we take when we're considering accessibility for those?
Stories are extremely inaccessible. I am super sad to say that, but they are inaccessible when you write on them. People can't zoom into that unless they take a photo of your story. And traditionally, multiple of the fonts that exist for Instagram right now and Facebook tend to be inaccessible fonts. Refer to whatever we chatted about when we talked about type. Definitely use that. I just caught that question. Do screen readers work with stories? No, they don't. Screen readers will treat stories as if it's just an image because the coding backend of Instagram and Facebook right now will translate whatever you write as a JPEG and not necessarily as something that's translatable. So you can reshare a post, obviously, and then they'll get a notification that this is kind of hyperlinked and they can click on it and can be clicked and will take them to another post. But in terms of you writing information into it or even putting alt text in a story, it's currently not even possible at all, to my knowledge, at least. But yeah, stories are a bit of a mess. I'm really hoping that Facebook and like the platforms just work on them, because right now they're not great.
Got it. Just one question as we're reaching 2 p.m. Sorry, 3 p.m. Moving forward, what methods can I learn to ensure that social media and my communications are actually part of the creation process rather than an afterthought? Do you have any tips around that?
100%. I'll send you my slideshow, first of all. You know what I mean? Like, think about it at the very beginning. I think this is the most important thing. Never think about, once you design a graphic, that's it. The graphic is designed. You can try to make it accessible for a social media post, but it will still be inaccessible because you did not think about how to design it in an accessible way when you started with it. So think about that. The beginning of what your workshop is, at the very, very beginning, when you're even thinking about budget for a workshop or for an experience. Do you have budget for an ASL interpreter for a workshop, for example, that you're going to be advertising about? Do you have the ability to make a PDF accessible version of whatever text is possible? Do you have the ability to have live captions on site? Ask yourself all of these questions. And if you're able to do a good percentage of them, do them, and also be transparent about the things you cannot do. And be very frank and honest about it. I really think it's really important to be telling your audience the things that you're unable to do and where your limitations lie, and not pretend like you have it all figured out and like they don't even matter in your space. Tell them that you're thinking about them, but because we live in a capitalist world and we can't escape it, here's what I'm able to offer you instead. So start at the beginning, think from the very top of like, oh, how am I making a workshop? How am I making an event? How am I making an online like social media post? How am I making it accessible? And that should be your second question after, what is the thing that I'm making in the first place?
Got it. Thank you so much, Yasmin. Sorry, folks, that we weren't able to get through all the questions. We will share Yasmin's slides and the links that she shared to different resources. And feel free to email us as well with any additional questions that you might have, and we're happy to connect. Again, Yasmin, thank you truly so much for giving us so much important information. I feel more ready just to approach all these tools. And
huge shout out to the interpreters. This this would not be accessible without them. So definitely just very, very like lots of gratitude for each of them. They're incredible. And I love watching them translate what I have to say. So that's always a privilege.
Yes, of course. Special thank you to Savannah Dean from the Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service for your hard work. As we said, the recording of this webinar will be available on our website with English and French captions in the coming weeks. We'll send that as an email to all of us who attended and those who were not able to attend as well. And if you're interested in joining more webinars and other learning opportunities that we offer throughout the year, you can subscribe to our newsletter through our website, follow our social media channels for timely updates. The links are also in the chat. And I specifically invite you to check our resources page where you can access free resources that are not only relevant to planning Culture Days events, but also to engage your community with arts and culture year round. And once again, National Culture Day celebrations are taking place September 23rd, October 16th, with thousands of outdoors, indoors, and online events in every corner of the country that will celebrate arts and culture and communities. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Yasmin, Savannah, and Dean again. Thank you, folks.